As the church moved into the 2nd century, things changed dramatically. And the changes actually began considerably earlier. The major event that transformed the 1st century church was simply the passage of time. The passage of time inevitably brought about two consequences. The first of these consequences is that those who were the eyewitnesses to the life and the ministry and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, those who walked around and said, "I myself have actually seen this man teach," those people began to die off. And when the eyewitnesses began to die off, a major source of information for the gospel, for the story, the narrative that was energizing the church, the major source of that information was being cut off for the church. Now, in a particular religious movement, a new religious movement, when that happens, one or two things take place. Either the religious group just begins to fade away, and within a generation or so of those who had the actual memory of the events, there's no more church to be found. That's one alternative. There is, in fact, a second alternative, and this is the one that the Christian church and the Christian tradition took. The second alternative is that the church turns to institutionalization. The church begins to make itself more into an institution. Now, the difference between an institution and a movement is that in a movement, it's the personalities that carry the organization forward. And in the case of the Christian tradition, by personalities, we're talking about first Jesus and then the early disciples and apostles who followed after him. When you get to an institution, it's no longer the personalities, although certainly the church has had its share of personalities, but it's rather the structures, the organizational structures. So the thing that changed from the 1st century church to the 2nd century church is now the church begins to take on organizational structures. The church begins to develop what I call hierarchies. That is, whereas before everybody was kind of in a common group, and if natural leadership just arose from within the group, that leadership was recognized. And now all of a sudden we get some very designated offices, church offices that individuals hold. The first thing we see is that those who were bishops of larger and more important churches became more important than those who were bishops of smaller churches. And then the bishops of certain major urban centers in the Roman Empire took on a kind of supervisory role over the bishops of some of the lesser parishes. And all of a sudden we begin to see an organizational structure that resembles that which we know from what are called Episcopal church structures, which includes the Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopalian Church, the Methodist Church, where there's this kind of a hierarchy. Well, this hierarchy develops following the deaths of the eyewitnesses. Another thing that happens as a result of the deaths of the eyewitnesses is that the memory of the apostles, those original disciples that Jesus surrounded himself with, the memory of the apostles becomes elevated and they become revered, and anything, any story, any writing, any words that could be connected with one of those apostles, well, those words are saved by the church, and those words are copied and passed from community to community. And so we see at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century that the writings of some of these early church leaders become what we call canonized. That is, they begin to appear on official lists of those recognized apostolic documents. And so what we see is the coalescing, the bringing together of what comes to be called the New Testament. Another major effect of the passage of time is that the early first century Christians expected that Jesus, who had left them, they believed, carried off into heaven, would momentarily return, would return and establish his kingdom on earth within their lifetimes. The early Christians, and this could be plainly seen in the writings of the New Testament, expected Jesus to return within their lifetimes. Now, when that didn't happen, when the expected return of Jesus didn't happen, well, then they looked around at each other and they either we're going to give up and say that obviously our devotion was incorrectly placed, or else we're going to figure out some way to continue this organization on beyond the passing on of its founder. And so, once again, we get to the institutionalization of the church. Whereas in the early decades of the church, they spoke of faith. And faith was for them a verb, a way in which they made their connection with God. In the second century, and actually in some of the later documents of the first century, we begin to hear of the faith, an established body of teaching that all the churches bring together and agree on. So the question that I want to leave you with is, is this change in the church an improvement? And before you rush and say no, I just want you to be aware that had they not done so, the church would not have continued. I mentioned a little earlier that the bishops that were associated with the major urban centers tended to exercise some kind of supervision over the parts of the church that were around them, and there came to be a kind of parallel between the exercise of authority of a bishop and the influence of that urban center. Now, there were in fact 5 major Roman urban centers that became the most significant churches, and this began at the end of the first century and continued on into the second. Of course, the first of the major cities was Jerusalem, where the church was founded, and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, and the Jerusalem church ceased to have a significant kind of influence. The other important cities, and I would like you to be aware of these cities and where they are located, and we'll probably put some flesh onto the different characteristics of Christianity in these cities when we meet in class. But there's Antioch in Syria, what's modern-day Syria, Alexandria in Egypt, and I will say one thing about Alexandria. Alexandria was a major center of learning in the Roman Empire, and it had been for hundreds of years. There's a legendary library in Alexandria which was sadly burned, and there are works that we know existed in that library that there were no other copies, and we haven't had them for thousands of years. So Alexandria, as one would expect, became a major center of learning and theology in the church. And then there's Constantinople, which was the eastern capital founded by Constantine, and that is in modern-day Turkey. It's the modern-day city of Istanbul. And finally, and most importantly, for obvious historical and actually some theological reasons, was Rome. And the Bishop of Rome became not only the dominant bishop for the area around the urban center of Rome, which was the largest city in the empire, but began to exercise some measure of supervision and authority over the entire Western Church. That is, those parts of the Roman Empire that were given to the Western administrative district and ultimately the Western emperors. So the Bishop of Rome became the authority for the Western Church, And the Eastern churches, the other ones I mentioned, Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, they each retained their relative independence. And so obviously what I'm talking about are some of the historical reasons of why the Bishop of Rome, who comes to be called El Papa, which means father, and that's where we get the word pope. So this is the rise of the institution of what's called the papacy in Rome. Theologically, there is a very old Christian tradition which associates both the Apostles Peter and the Apostles Paul in Rome. There's a very old and well-founded tradition that says that Peter and Rome died and were buried. Peter and Paul died and were buried in Rome. So there is the fact of the two authoritative apostles of the first century church being associated with the city of Rome, and the fact that the Bishop of Rome traces his authority back through these individuals. And finally, there's that very interesting statement in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus says, on this, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And there always has, again, a very ancient Christian tradition, an association of the first position among the apostles among Peter. And it's for these reasons why there arose within the Western church, that church that's roughly coterminous with what we think of as Western Europe, the current modern countries of France and Italy and Great Britain and Germany and the lowland countries. And all of those countries were dominated very quickly by the Bishop of Rome.